Hey everyone! Today we're talking about one of the most exciting times in Japanese history, the Meiji Period, which lasted from 1868 to 1912. This was a time when Japan changed incredibly fast, going from an isolated, old-fashioned society to a modern, powerful country in just a few decades. It all started in 1868 when the Tokugawa shogunate, which had ruled Japan for over 250 years, was overthrown in what's called the Meiji Restoration. The new government, led by Emperor Meiji, wanted to make sure Japan was strong enough to stand up to powerful European countries. So, they made big changes, building a government like the ones in Europe, creating modern industries, and forming a strong military. By the early 1900s, Japan had already won wars against China and even Russia, proving it had become a major world power. But how did Japan change so quickly? Well, even before the Meiji period, Japan was already preparing for the future. During the Edo period, the country had been at peace for more than 250 years. Even though the government was divided between the Tokugawa shogunate and local rulers called daimyo, Japan was well organized. There were good roads, a strong economy, and even early factories making things like cotton, silk, paper, and salt. Education also played a big role. Unlike many other countries at the time, Japan had a high literacy rate. Samurai, who used to be warriors, had become more like government workers, so many daimyo set up schools to train them. Regular people could also go to small private schools called terakoya. Thanks to printing technology, books were widely available, and educated people were able to discuss politics and social issues, even though free speech was limited. Still, Japan faced a big challenge. Europe and the United States were becoming more powerful and wanted to trade with Japan. Since the early 1600s, the Tokugawa government had limited contact with the outside world, only allowing some trade with China, Korea, and the Dutch. But by the late 1700s, Western countries had gone through the Industrial Revolution, which gave them a huge technological advantage. By the mid-1800s, countries like Britain, France, Russia, and the United States were pressuring Japan to open up. The biggest moment came in 1852, when American commander Meiji Period arrived with warships and demanded that Japan start trading. The Tokugawa government had no choice but to agree, signing treaties that let foreigners live and trade in Japan. Many Japanese were furious, feeling like their country was being pushed around. Some wanted to go back to Japan's old ways and get rid of foreigners, using the slogan, "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians." But when they attacked foreign ships, European navies fired back, showing that Japan couldn't just force them out. The Tokugawa tried to strengthen their military, but before they could, they were overthrown in 1868 by forces from Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa. Even though the revolution was supposed to give power back to the emperor, the real control went to the leaders of the rebellion, figures like Okubo Toshimiki, Saigo Takamori, Ito Hirobumi, and Yamagata Aritomo. They set up a new government and used the emperor as a symbol of power, just like the Tokugawa had before. In 1869, they moved the capital from Kyoto to Edo, renaming it Tokyo, which means Eastern Capital. They also got rid of the old feudal system, replacing the daimyo's domains with a centralized government. The social class system, which divided people into samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants, was also abolished. Former samurai were given a new status called shizoku and paid for a while, but it was clear Japan was moving on. One of the biggest goals was creating a strong military. The government used European ideas to build a modern army and navy, and made military service mandatory for all men. To pay for these changes, they introduced a new tax system. Another major challenge was fixing the unfair treaties Japan had signed with Western countries. These treaties stopped Japan from controlling its own trade policies and allowed foreigners to ignore Japanese laws. To convince Western countries that Japan was just as modern as they were, the government sent a group of diplomats and scholars on a mission in 1871 to study Western countries. While they didn't immediately fix the treaties, They learned a lot that helped Japan grow stronger. With Japan opening up, Western culture poured in. People started wearing Western-style clothes, building European-style buildings, and reading about new ideas. Fukuzawa Yukichi, one of Japan's most influential thinkers, encouraged people to embrace modern ways. Printing technology improved, leading to more newspapers and magazines spreading information faster than ever. Not everyone liked these changes. By the 1870s, many people wanted more political freedom, and the freedom and popular rights movement pushed for democracy. The government cracked down on protests, but eventually agreed to introduce a constitution. However, they still wanted to keep most of the power. In 1885, they created a cabinet system where the emperor appointed ministers. Then, in 1889, Japan adopted the Meiji Constitution, which created a national parliament. The House of Representatives was elected, but only about 1% of the population could vote. The House of Peers was made up of nobles and people chosen by the emperor. Even though the elected officials didn't have much power, political parties quickly formed and started competing for influence. Meanwhile, some traditionalists were getting frustrated. In 1877, Saigo Takamori, one of the leaders of the Meiji Restoration, led a rebellion against the government, hoping to restore samurai power. The government used its modern army to defeat him, and this was the last major samurai battle in Japanese history. And during the Meiji period, Japan changed rapidly, becoming an industrialized and modern nation. What made this period so remarkable was how quickly Japan adapted to new technology. Even before the Meiji Era, Japan already had a strong economy under the Tokugawa rule, trading goods like silk, cotton, paper, and salt. Local leaders, known as daimyo, worked with merchants to increase production since they often needed more money. This teamwork between government and private businesses continued into the Meiji Era and became a key part of Japan's rapid industrialization. Unlike some countries where industries grew mainly through private businesses, the Japanese government took an active role in the process. Some industries like railways, iron and steel production weren't attractive to private investors because they weren't immediately profitable. However, they were necessary for the country's military and economic strength, so the government invested in them. At the same time, the government made sure private businesses had the support they needed to grow. Japan already had a strong group of business leaders from the Edo period, including powerful families known as zaibatsu, like Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Mitsui. These groups used their wealth to fund new industries and helped push Japan's modernization forward. Japan's industrialization happened in the middle of two key phases of the Industrial Revolution. The first phase, which started in the late 1700s, introduced machines powered by steam engines, including trains and textile machines. The second phase, beginning in the 1870s, focused on chemical and scientific advancements, leading to the invention of synthetic fabrics, fertilizers, and petroleum-based products. While Western countries spent decades developing these technologies, Japan quickly caught up. The Meiji government made education a top priority, especially in science and engineering, so Japanese students could learn about the latest Western technology and apply it in their own country. Even though Japan was modernizing, its economy still relied heavily on agriculture, and industrialization came at a cost. Farmers faced high taxes, and factory workers endured harsh conditions. However, the economic growth helped Japan become a rising military power. By the late 1800s, Japan was strong enough to compete with other nations. Its first major test came in 1894 during the First Sino-Japanese War. At the time, Korea was influenced by China, but Japan saw this as a threat. If a powerful country like Russia took over Korea, Japan's security would be at risk. Although China was much larger than Japan, it was not as well organized. Japan's modernized military won the war, surprising the world. This victory allowed Japan to expand its influence on the Asian mainland. Just 10 years later, Japan went to war again, this time against Russia. After defeating China, Japan had gained control of important areas in northern China, but Russian expansion in the region became a concern. In 1904, Japan launched an attack, and once again, it shocked the world by defeating a European power. Although Japan didn't gain as much as it had hoped from the peace treaty, the victory proved that Japan was now a global power. In 1910, Japan officially took control of Korea, marking its rise as a colonial empire, something that seemed impossible just a few decades earlier. One of the most important changes during the Meiji period was the creation of a national education system. Japan already had high literacy rates during the Edo period, but the Meiji government made education mandatory. Primary school attendance became required for boys, and the government built high schools and universities. The focus was on teaching science and engineering so that Japan could continue advancing in industry and military technology. However, education wasn't just about academics. By the 1890s, schools were also used to promote nationalism. Before the Meiji Era, Japan was divided into over 200 different regions, each with its own identity. The government wanted to unite the people and encourage national pride. Some officials worried that too much Western influence could weaken Japan's traditions. As a result, government-linked intellectuals promoted the idea that Japan was special because its emperors were descended from the gods. They also taught that loyalty to the emperor was a key part of Japanese identity. These ideas were reinforced in schools through ceremonies honoring the imperial family, and by teaching traditional Shinto myths. In 1891, the imperial rescript on education was introduced, making these lessons a formal part of the school system. As nationalism grew, the government became more critical of certain beliefs. Christianity, which had gained popularity after Japan opened to the world, was seen as a foreign influence that didn't fit with Japan's identity. Socialism, which was appealing to factory workers facing poor conditions, was also viewed as a threat to national unity. In 1910, a group of socialists was accused of plotting to assassinate Emperor Meiji. Even though the evidence was weak, 24 people were convicted, and 11 were executed. The Meiji period was a time of massive change, and Japan transformed faster than most countries in history. While many Western ideas were adopted, Japan didn't simply copy other nations, it blended new technology with its own traditions. This balance between modernization and cultural identity became a defining feature of modern Japan.